Every grade level team, K through 5, looking at those first screener scores, identifying any student who's below the 25th percentile in any area, and developing Tier 2 plans for those students. And then, like Dr. Mitchell just mentioned, we observe the interventions during classroom instruction. As we said before, the screeners are given 3 times a year. The research-based interventions are practiced. And then the third bullet's really important, quick assessments. So that progress monitoring is also done quickly. It's not an hour and a half kind of assessment to see where the child is right now. We don't want to take away from Tier 1 classroom instruction. So that's the goal. And then decisions are made.
So the decisions that are made must be based on the data. Emotions are not reliable data to make informed decisions. And it's difficult for a parent, teachers, and for us, because we are sensitive, we are emotional when it comes to making decisions about students. But when you take the emotional piece out, the qualitative piece out, and just look at the quantitative data on how that student is producing in class, that's what helps drive our plans to make them more black and white, in the sense that, well, clearly the student's having difficulty with learning. So that's what the plan should be about. And it helps drive discussion when we're just looking at the data and our emotions are taken out.
It also helps prevent a lot of students in the past were overlooked who had learning disabilities. They were quiet, they were happy, they did what they needed to do enough to get by. And so sometimes, you know, they would get to 4th and 5th grade and really start struggling. We're like, wait, what happened? And so when we just continue to go back to the data, not only do we catch those kids, but we also see kids who maybe have a learning disability, but they're compensating. And ultimately, that's what you want. You can't cure a learning disability. You can give a child the skills needed to compensate for that learning disability or other type of disability. So that's ultimately everybody's goal, and if we continue to focus on that data, then the team can really construct a solid instructional plan.
So Tier 4s are our last tier of intervention, and that's based on the data collected in the student's progress from the previous 3 tiers. The student has gone through the student support team. The student support team has met several times, attempted several different interventions, and yet the student is still struggling. Well, at that point, we involve Mrs. Rogers, and then we talk about the possibility of referring the student for a comprehensive educational and or psychological evaluation to determine if a student has a learning disability. But again, prior to doing this, we've talked about a lot of steps that take place prior to getting to Tier 4. So Tier 4, that's what Mrs. Rogers is going to talk about today.
And I think we'd be amiss if we don't tell you that Tier 4 also includes gifted education. So there's a whole nother face of this pyramid of intervention. It's minimized at the bottom, Carrie. Tier 4, 13, all the way over the right.
That's me.
Yep. So students who are showing significant strengths in areas also go through the pyramid of intervention and are referred for gifted eligibility at that point. So there's also that whole piece. Today we really we focus on students who are struggling in areas, but the flip side also happens. Instructional plans are put in place for kids who are showing an advanced area of strength, and then gifted eligibility and gifted education is at Tier 4 as well.
Hey, so with that actually being said, I am going to talk about the Department of Special Education at Maryland. So special education can encompass a multitude of types of disabilities, types of service plans, types of settings, but I really geared this presentation just focused on special education at our school. And currently right now, we actually added a new program to our school this year, which is an autism classroom. So we actually have 2 units, which this is the first time I've been here 10 years, so the first time in 10 years we've had something besides the interrelated program, which we are all really excited to have on board. So currently, our first program, we have what we call an interrelated special education program, and that type of program is set education teacher who is actually certified when you go take the state mandated test. It's an interrelated teacher, so I have a certification as an interrelated teacher. And we instruct students in the general education setting and also in the special education setting. And just to go back to, there's also times where a child may not actually have one of these disabilities. They might have something else, but they're showing characteristics and they might better be served in a related program. So just because a child isn't actually have an eligibility report with one of these disability categories does not mean that they cannot be served in an interrelated special education program. Okay. So currently, right now at Maryland, I'm the lead special education teacher. So I split my time between teaching in the classroom and doing more of the background work, like Dr. Mitchell mentioned earlier. So I help out with Ashley once a child is starting to move towards the evaluation process, and setting up meetings, starting the process of getting kids tested, and then once they are tested, scheduling meetings to have the eligibility meetings, and if they do qualify for special education, moving forward with that and setting up meetings for to start an individual education plan, which that's called an IEP. So we also have another interrelated teacher on staff. Her name is Carol Patterson, and she teaches full-time. And we also have Ayana Clay Brooks, who's a new paraprofessional with Maryland this year. And we just have Michael Block is just on staff today.
Michael.
He's a paraprofessional and helping out with the interrelated program. So we're really excited to have him on board. So the next program that we have currently is an Autism BC unit. And this program serves special education students who are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, or again, they may have just the characteristics of a child with an autism spectrum disorder. So this teacher is actually more specially or highly trained to help support students that have that type of disability. So they are able to provide greater assistance to that student than they would typically receive in a larger classroom with a larger student-to-teacher ratio. So currently, the staff for our autism unit is Diana Watkins, and she's an autism special education teacher. And she has 2 paraprofessionals in her classroom, and that's Brandon McClendon and Danielle Rogers. Other special education services that we have currently at Maryland, we have speech language pathology, and actually it's Melissa Rusty too, sorry. She's a newlywed. We also have children who receive deaf and hard of hearing services, and the teacher that comes out for that is Eileen Barrett. And just to let you know, these are not programs that are housed at Maryland. Due to the limited amount of students who have these needs, we don't have enough students to support a full-time position at the school. So these teachers move around from school to school. We also have related service providers. So these are services that can be provided to a student if they have an IEP. So they attach on to goals that are already in a student's IEP. So that is occupational therapy. And we actually have 2 teachers here now because we did have an increased amount of students that needed the services. So their time is split. That is Cynthia Taylor and Marcia Humans. And then we also have students who receive adaptive physical education services, and that person who provides those services is Vanessa Morton. And then we actually have an audiologist that comes out, and she works with our hearing impaired students, specifically to test their hearing or to adjust hearing aids or to assist those students with anything to do with their hearing. So, and this is again, I tailored this to Maryland. This continuum of services goes far beyond special education small group. So there is special education services that happen outside of the school. There's home instruction, there's medical facilities that provide special education. But this is where we stop at our school currently. So again, like Ms. Adamo said earlier, of course we want all students, the goal is to stay in the least restrictive environment is general education all day. However, if they've gone through all the tiers of RTI and we find that some of the interventions that are in place have not been working and they are found to have an eligibility and qualify for special education services, when we start to write an IEP, this is general education I didn't put up there, but, so we would start out with general education with consultative services, then we'd move to general education supportive services, general education with collaborative services, general education with co-teaching services, and then small group or special education services in a small group. So if you have a child on consultative services, again, this is how we're functioning currently at Mary Lynn. And I do have students, or we do have students that are on consultative. They need minimal academic support in the classroom. This means they are in general education all day. They are not getting provided services. I would actually, or the teacher would actually just check in with that teacher through maybe weekly, depending on what their IEP says. It might be bi-monthly, but they're checking in just to see how that student's doing, if they're meeting grade level standards. And it's more of a monitoring phase, and it's usually a transitional phase. Like the students that I have on consultative right now, the next time they get evaluated, they're probably going to test out of the special education program. Okay, and so general education with supportive instruction. This again, this is provided by a paraprofessional. So this means a student is in the general education classroom, but they don't need, the services that they need doesn't need to be provided by a certified special education teacher. So this may be a child who just needs a little more prompting, a little bit more redirecting to follow teacher instructions, to complete grade level assignments, and they're able to complete grade level assignments with the accommodations and modifications that are listed in their IEP. Then we have general education with collaborative services. We currently don't have anybody with this service at Mary Lynn right now. And again, things change day to day, week to week. So, but this would be where a teacher, a special education teacher, would actually go into a teaching segment. But they don't have to be in there the whole time. So let's say there's a social studies block, and that might last 60 minutes. So that student is actually able to, follow the curriculum with the teacher, provide the accommodations and modifications, and then the teacher may come in for part of that segment and actually work with that student on the assignment that they're working on, or a group of students. And then we have co-teaching. So this is actually when there is a general education teacher in the classroom and a special education teacher in the classroom, and they are totally sharing the teaching responsibilities of that classroom. So again, these the student will probably require specialized instruction throughout the class period, so that's why the special education teacher is in there. And that special education teacher and general education teacher can come up collaboratively with ways to meet each student's needs. So it might be that they're doing one activity, but this group of kids, and sometimes it's not just the special education students in there, but due to data or what we pre-assessed or formative assessment, we might say this group of students may need a little extra help on this skill. So developing different and alternative activities, but it's still meeting the Common Core standards. And it may also mean that the test is set up a little differently. So if there's a summative or test at the end of the unit or an activity that is still showing that that child's mastered it, it could be possibly less questions, it could be less writing, it can be administered orally, but just alternate ways, but still showing that that child's mastering that criteria. And again, if you're getting co-taught services, we're still progress monitoring quite frequently, just to see how those children are doing towards their goals and objectives. And then we have small group special education services, and so this is when a child is actually pulled out of the classroom for the entire segment of a subject area. Typically, these students are significantly below grade level. So if you have a child that's in 5th grade and reading on a second grade reading level, they may be pulled out to get small group instruction. And in a small group setting, sometimes curriculum, if it's appropriate, may be modified. So the teacher is actually working on the essential standards, but may not be hitting every single standard because that teacher is having to do a balancing act of meeting that kid's needs where they are and the teaching models, and Ms. Berry and I are doing 4th grade reading, English language arts, and Ms. Starks and Ms. Thompson, it's actually Mrs. Patterson, she was doing it last year, is doing 3rd grade math. So that's just sort of special education in a nutshell, but if you guys have any questions, I can feel free to ask and I can try to answer them. Yes.
What's an example of a child who might need small group services, a kindergarten person?
Well, typically, we haven't had, the past couple years, we haven't had a lot of kindergartners come in a small group. What really happens when a child comes in kindergarten, that gap, if they are experiencing some difficulties, we're not really seeing a huge gap because we don't know how far below grade level are because they're at the beginning of the grade. So sometimes it's tricky in kindergarten to determine whether a student needs to be pulled out for that academic or not. Typically when we get students who are not already coming in, like for example our Autism BC unit, most of those students were found in what Atlanta Public Schools is called a Child Find program. So the federal government provides federal funding for school districts to support and evaluate and give services to children aged 3 through 5. So if a child, let's say, was receiving services from 3 through 5 and they came in to a kindergarten program that were already a part of that type of classroom, they just transitioned into it. So for example, our children who are in kindergarten, we only have one who's in kindergarten in the autism unit, that child was in a similar program prior to coming to Maryland and just transitioned into the program. However, we have other students who aren't even diagnosed or don't start the SST process in kindergarten, or we have children who come in and haven't received services through that type of program. And typically, I would like to monitor how they're doing before making any, dramatic decisions. But I think especially in kindergarten, I like to always lean on the side of let's see how they do first before we say, no, I don't think you need to be in that classroom. Because a kindergartner too, just to give you a brief example, I want to say probably 7 or 8 years ago, we had a student that came to Maryland, and that student spent probably up in, I don't know if you would hear that, but spent probably up until about 10:30 screaming every morning and did not want to be at school, didn't want to be in kindergarten, and that child left Maryland in a consultative model in special education and is now very successful at Inman, and so it's very difficult to predict what a kindergarten child is going to do from day 1 to that last day of school.
I think the screeners have become really key, especially with those younger students, because teachers in kindergarten and 1st grade either do one or two things. They either overly think, oh, this kid is way below grade level, because a lot of our kids come in with a lot of pre-K experience. But the child may not have received instruction, and not receiving instruction doesn't mean you need special education. If you've never been exposed to letter sounds, there's no way for you to know them. And then, or the flip side of that, when teachers are like, well, they're new, they just need to get used to things and I'm not really sure. And then we waited, and then it would come out in 3rd grade, wait. There's some true issues here we need to put in place. We need to put something in place for the student. So the universal screen